Thank you for joining us today on the Larkin Trail. You'll hear more about this splendid Royal Hotel in a moment, but first let's take a quick look at the history of the city of Hull. It dates back to the 1100s and was built where the two rivers, the Hull and the Humber, meet up. In those days it was called Wyke. Then, in 1293, the King of England, Edward I, paid it a visit, bought it, and renamed it Kingston upon Hull. In Victorian times, with the Industrial Revolution, people came in from the country to work on the docks. The worst part of the city's history was in World War II, and it's now accepted that after London, Hull was probably the most bombed city in the country. When Philip Larkin arrived here in 1955 to take up his post as university librarian, it was a very different city from the one you see today. Hull was still recovering from the Blitz. Larkin thought it was a little chilly and smelled of fish. We'll now go out onto the station concourse to the rear of the hotel. Here you can see the wonderful bronze statue of Larkin. It was commissioned by the Philip Larkin Society and created by the acclaimed sculptor Martin Jennings. The statue was unveiled by the Lord Mayor of Hull on the 2nd of December 2010, the 25th anniversary of Larkin's death. It also marked the end of Larkin 25, a very rich and varied programme of events commemorating his life and work. If you take a closer look at the statue, you'll see an extract from the Whitsun Weddings. In this poem, Larkin describes his departure from Hull at Whitsun, saying, "We ran behind the backs of houses, crossed a street of blinding windscreens, smelt the fish dock, thence the river's level drifting breath began, where Skye and Lincolnshire and water meet." The statue's sculptor, Martin Jennings, also created the statue of Sir John Betjeman that stands on St Pancras Station. Back inside the Royal Hotel, you can see a photograph of Larkin and Betjeman together. It's on the wall at the far end of the bar, just near the lifts, and shows the pair at the ceremony where Betjeman received his honorary degree. The hotel itself dates back to 1851 and took the name of Royal because Queen Victoria and Prince Albert stayed here in 1854. You can see a commemorative plaque by the lifts. Unfortunately, the hotel suffered a big fire in about 1990 and much of it was rebuilt. Larkin spent a lot of time here in the Royal Hotel. He'd often have lunch in the Brigantine restaurant, which was downstairs and sadly no longer here, or meet people for drinks in this lounge, or dine here before going home after attending a function in the city centre. The hotel inspired him to write a poem about it, Friday Night in the Royal Station Hotel, where he talks about silence laid like carpet and says, "Hours pass and all the salesmen have gone back to Leeds, leaving full ashtrays in the conference room." It was actually very rare for Larkin to name specific places in the titles of his poems. We'll now leave the Royal Hotel and cross Ferrons Way into Paragon Square. The large department store Hammond's, which was called Binns for some of Larkin's time here, is a good example of a 1950s rebuild on its original site, following the devastation of World War II. Standing with your back to Hammond's, this is a completely different view from the one that Larkin was used to. Paragon Station has developed into the big new interchange, and, along to the right, you can see the new development of St Stephen's Shopping Centre. Then further along you have Hull Truck Theatre, which used to be in a much smaller building around the corner. Larkin attended Alan Plater's play, Prez, there. He and Plater had become good friends because they shared a love of jazz music. After Larkin's death, Plater wrote Sweet Sorrow, where Larkin appeared posthumously as a guest at a dinner party. Leaving Paragon Square behind and heading down Paragon Street, it's well worth taking a look at the architecture along the way. You can see a real mix of styles from the 1950s, 60s and 70s, and halfway down there's a striking Victorian arcade. Larkin did come into the centre of town now and then, and although he seemed to enjoy giving the appearance of looking in on the 1960s, he did a bit more than just observe, as his poem, Annus Mirabilis, shows. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. Arriving at the far end of Paragon Street in Queen Victoria Square, you can see plenty of wonderful architecture. The City Hall, a big purpose-built concert hall from the 1900s, dominates the square and has quite a few links with Larkin. He came here for university degree ceremonies, including the one where he gave the citation for John Betjeman, which are still held here, and for music concerts and even boxing. During one particular boxing bout, it was heard to mutter under his breath, "Only connect." It was a classical music concert here that inspired him to write Broadcast. He was sitting at home in his attic flat in Pearson Park, listening to it on the radio, imagining his loved one here at the City Hall, and he wrote, "Your hands tiny in all that air, applauding." This is a lovely square to look around. If you stand outside the Tourist Information Centre, you are surrounded by some impressive Victorian and Edwardian architecture. The Ferrans Art Gallery on your right, the Maritime Museum across the square, and the Yorkshire Penny Bank in the distance. Also, by the City Hall, you'll notice some fishy plaques in the pavement. They form part of the Seven Seas Fish Trail, and if you like to follow that trail on another visit, you can pick up a leaflet from Tourist Information. We're now going to leave the square and head towards Whiteford, how we pronounce it locally, by the Pelican Crossing outside the Prince's Quay Shopping Centre. Just at the other side of the crossing, if you take a look down at the pavement, you'll see a square plaque showing the original site of the Wilberforce Monument. It was moved from here in 1935 and now stands opposite the very far end of Queen's Gardens. They begin at the big fountain just beyond the Maritime Museum, and though it's hard to believe, the gardens are where Hull's first dock, Queen's Dock, used to be. Queen Victoria sailed through the dock in 1854, and when Larkin arrived here, just over 100 years later, there were still ships coming into the city centre. Surrounded by railings is Beverley Gate. Here they managed to excavate part of the medieval wall. This is where Charles I was not allowed in 1642. It was also where, outside of the walls, the original dock system was. Prince's Quay is the site of the original Prince's Dock, and at the other side you have Queen's Gardens or Queen's Dock. In his poem Here, Larkin describes Hull as a city where domes and statues, spires and cranes cluster. Along Whiteford we get to Marks and Spencer. How cool is it to have a Larkin poem in your store? Unlike the Royal Hotel, it's not named specifically in the poem. The large cool store is a reference to this Marks and Spencer of the 1960s. Larkin writes, "The large cool store selling cheap clothes, set out in simple sizes, plainly." Larkin had a lot of female staff at the library, and apparently they were always coming back from lunchtime shopping trips with Marks and Spencer's bags, so he decided to come and see for himself. It takes a little bit of finding, but you can see a copy of the poem on the ground floor by the lift. Outside Marks and Spencer, it's worth taking a look at the main entrance. The store was purpose-built in the 1930s. If you stand back a little and take a look up, you'll see the maritime motif at the top. Although locally it's pronounced Whiteford, this street was named after the Whitefriars or Carmelites who used to live in this area. Most of one side, along your right as we head down to the bottom, is owned by Hull Trinity House. Trinity House as an institution are nearly as old as the city itself, and we're responsible for all the maritime affairs around Hull. And that's why there are still some really interesting pieces of architecture above the modern shops. For example, walking further along to Boots and the Works, you can see what used to be the Neptune Inn. If you take a look at the pavement opposite, just near the bank, you'll notice a shark, again part of the fish trail. At the end of Whiteford, just before it becomes Silver Street, you'll find the Land of Green Ginger to your left. Land of Green Ginger is one of the country's most unusual street names. There are lots of theories about where it got its name from, but nobody really knows. It's inspired writers, including Winifred Holtby and Alan Plater. Larkin knew the old town well, because he used to come to functions around here, and as we'll see later on, there are some splendid pubs to be discovered. Land of Green Ginger is also the site of the smallest window in England. Can you see it? It was a lookout window for the George pub when the George was a coaching inn. There's a room behind the window where the stable hand used to sit. We'll now head back across the bottom of Whitefordgate and over into Trinity Square, passing the entrance to the indoor Trinity Market on your left. In Trinity Square itself, you've got the whole of Hull's history in one place. Starting with the church and going round, you've got the Church of Holy Trinity, which dates from medieval times, the old grammar school from the 1500s, which is now the Hands-on History Museum, the Merchant's Warehouse from the 1800s, which is now apartments, Prince Street, beyond the small archway, which dates back to the 1700s, and the 1980s apartments, and the modern sculpture on the corner that tells you the city's history. Then, standing proudly in the square, is the statue of another great writer, Andrew Marvell. He was MP for Hull from 1658 to 1678. They call this the Wandering Statue because it's been moved around quite a few times, but it seems to be well settled here now. Andrew Motion, who taught at the university and is also Larkin's biographer, unveiled the statue when it was brought to the square. So Larkin was part of a literary tradition that's always been here, with writers such as Douglas Dunn, Alan Plater, Winifred Holtby and Stevie Smith. The Australian writer Peter Porter described Hull as the most poetic city in England. If you take a look at the base of the statue, you'll find a verse from Marvell's poem To His Coy Mistress. And now, with time's winged chariot hurrying near, we'll leave the square through the archway into Prince Street. Prince Street is the most picturesque street in the city. It's got an elegant curve, and if you take a look back when you're near the end, you get a wonderful view of the Tower of Holy Trinity. We now turn the corner into Dagger Lane, which is so called because daggers were once made here. In Victorian times, it was also the red light district, and sailors came pouring in off the docks. They could find everything they wanted around Dagger Lane: women, fights and alcohol. The docks are still very much in evidence when you get to the busy dual carriageway, with all the lorries going by, so please be careful as you cross Castle Street at the Pelican Crossing. We're now going over to the marina, which opened in 1983. It's made from the Humber Dock and the railway dock, which both became disused in the 1960s, and Larkin wrote about ships up streets. Notice all the European flags flying, which you wouldn't see in many other cities. As you walk away from Castle Street alongside the marina, take a look at the walkway. The red bricks indicate where the ruins of the medieval walls actually lie. The walls disappeared during the construction of the docks in the 1800s, when they were covered by mud and spoil, but they are now cleverly marked out along the promenade. The River Humber used to be much wider than it is now. Shortly, you'll notice a circular shape in the walkway, again with red brick markings coming out from it, and this actually marks the original bank of the Humber. When they were developing the docks, they deposited the mud into the river, so the ground you're standing on beyond the circular mark is actually reclaimed land, hence the name Humber Street across the road. You'll notice that the streets suddenly become wider because they're no longer medieval, and they're named after the heroes of the time, such as Wellington and Nelson. Until 2010, much of this area, and Humber Street in particular, was the site of the city's thriving fruit market. It's now gradually reinventing itself as part of Hull's cultural quarter. Passing Humber Street, we'll now continue straight ahead towards the estuary and then turn left at the Minerva pub and look at what remains of the pier. This is the Humber estuary, with Yorkshire on this side and Lincolnshire across there on the other. It's hard to believe, but it's actually 22 miles out to the North Sea. Queen Victoria landed here when she visited Hull in 1854, and it's where the paddle steamers used to sail from before the Humber Bridge opened in 1981. Larkin wrote the words for a cantata by Anthony Hedges called Bridge for the Living to mark the opening of the bridge. It was first performed at the City Hall and then enjoyed again at the University of Hull as part of the Larkin 25 commemorations. The small cafe you can see used to be the waiting room. Behind you, in the building which is now apartments, was the British Rail booking office, where people bought their ferry tickets. It was actually one of the only British rail stations that had no railway tracks nearby. The ferries went across to New Holland in Lincolnshire, and then you could catch a train to Cleethorpes. In Larkin's day, lots of people just went for the round-trip ferry ride and didn't catch the onward train. The Monitor documentary, filmed by the BBC in 1964, shows Larkin and Betjeman enjoying a very windy ferry crossing to Lincolnshire. The statue you can see is of William Delapole, the first mayor of Hull in 1332, and he's looking towards the River Hull because that's where the port used to be before they built the docks. That's also where he made his fortune as a merchant. On the corner stands the elegant pilot office, which was once the home of the Humber pilots. They assist ships in and out of the estuary because of its shifting sandbanks and strong currents. Today the Humber pilots are situated at Spurn Point. As we pass by the old building, you'll notice a pilot fish in the pavement. Before turning right at the Ruscador pub into the extension of Humber Street, take a moment to enjoy the best view of Holy Trinity Church. The monumental tidal surge barrier opened in 1980 at the point where the two rivers meet. The barrier is lowered to prevent the spring tides entering the rest of the city. Turning right again, just before the Myton Bridge flyover, we use Rotten Herring Staithe to come close to the River Hull's edge. This stretch of the river is where the port of Hull was situated, right from the 1100s up until the 1800s. The iconic scale-in footbridge, a little way along here, due to be open in 2011, takes you across to Hull's most famous and popular attraction, the Deep. The merchants who traded with Europe lived on High Street. Their houses faced on to the front to display their wealth, while their warehouses backed onto the river, with access through a short, narrow street called a staithe. You'll notice one or two of these staithes as we go further along High Street. They were just wide enough to accommodate a cart or a sledge. Scale Lane Staithe takes us on to Hull's oldest and most fascinating street, High Street. In his poem here, Larkin describes the grain-scattered streets and the barge-crowded water. In High Street, on your left, is the Old Black Boy, where Larkin delivered a talk to the Hull Jazz Record Society on Pee Wee Russell, the famous clarinetist. Further along on the left is Maester House, owned by the National Trust. It has a magnificent staircase, which you can go in and view during their opening hours. On the right-hand side, further down, is the Museums Quarter, a collection of museums clustered around a small, peaceful garden. Here, you'll find street life, Hull and East Riding, and behind these, permanently berthed on the river, is the Arctic Corsair, Hull's last side-winding trawler, now open as a museum. In this quarter, you can also see the splendid Wilberforce House, which Larkin referred to as the Slave Museum. Also on High Street is Pease Warehouse. This was once owned by one of the city's merchants, Joseph Pease, who was among the first set of warehouses to open as apartments in 1981. We'll now cross over and cut through Gandy Way onto Alfred Gelder Street. Here is the White Hart, which has a wonderful listed tiled bar and was one of Larkin's favourites. He gave a talk here to the Hull Jazz Record Society entitled The Life and Death of a Record Reviewer. Leaving the White Hart behind, we'll continue along Alfred Gelder Street and pass in front of the magnificent Guildhall, home to Hull City Council. Along Wilberforce Drive is the imposing Wilberforce Monument, which looks along Queen's Gardens. This site was originally Hull's first dock, opened in 1788, and filled in the 1930s, and became gardens in 1935. Cross over George Street and down the side of the Position nightclub to the Hull History Centre. This distinctive building opened in 2010 and houses the city archives and those of the University of Hull. This is a suitable place to end the city centre part of the Larkin Trail because the History Centre also holds unique and extensive archives from the Larkin collection.